Hey guys, how are we all doing tonight? I hope everybody is having a wonderful Tuesday and a wonderful week so far. I'm really excited to be back with you guys. We get to take this one a little bit slower today. This is Cram Pass number 4. We've done 4 of these so far. We're almost halfway through at this point. This is the second part of Unit 3 that we're going to be covering today. Now, because we divided this, that is really hot tea. Because we divided up this unit into 2 parts, you get to kind of slow this one down a little bit, which is good because we're going to be talking about some relatively complex issues here today. We're going to be covering constitutionalism in England, predominantly England. I'll talk a little bit about how it spreads throughout the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. But we're going to be mostly focusing on England and all of its messy monarchy glory today. Now, I will say I am going to, of course, focus on content, but I am going to start talking a lot about utilizing this in your DBQ that you'll be taking at the end of May. So that is something I do want to start kind of pivoting towards. I know we've been focusing a lot on content, which I think that's kind of what you guys expected was to be a more content focused type deal, which is great. But I do want to also make sure that I'm talking about how you're going to use this on the AP exam. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, and we'll kind of talk about why are we talking about this stuff? Why is it relevant? So let's go ahead and roll right into it. So let me share my screen. Share. Present from beginning and presenter view. Perfect. All righty. We can all see that A-okay. All right. So one thing I do want to do is I am going to ask, some questions as we go through. And if you just want to put your answers in the chat, that way we can make things a little bit more interactive. Because I do feel like the last few streams, I've just been talking a whole lot, and I do want to interact a little bit more. So in the chat, if you just want to, whenever I ask a question, if you want to throw answers in there, that would be awesome. Also, if you have questions, of course, the Ask a Question tab is where to go. So please feel free to ask any and all questions, even if it was about content that we've already covered. I'm definitely on board with talking about that. Okay, so any and all questions, you can go ahead and throw them there. All right, let's go ahead and rock and roll and get started. So before we jump into things, I've talked about this last week. I'm going to talk about it again this week. Sounding like a broken record over here, but Fiveable is still offering free streams that are not Cram Pass streams, okay? I know you guys have paid to be in here, but if you want to do some free ones for any other AP classes you're taking, or if you want to do some more AP Euro classes, stream sessions, that is the calendar there. That is stuff that is on the test, but also not going to be included on the test, okay? So like AP Euro, for example, is covering some Unit 8 and Unit 9 content that's not going to be on the exam, but just to cover it. So if you want to tune in, that's the calendar. But that is also the social media stuff for Fiveable, my Twitter as well, if you want to drop me a line. But you guys already know that. Let's rock and roll. So this agenda is very deceiving because it looks like we have a lot of stuff to cover. This is actually probably going to be our most slow pace cram session to date. That is really just kind of like general talking points as we go through. Okay. But that is what we're going to be doing today. So if you want to go back and review, you can always look on the intro here, the intro slide, and shows what we're covering. Okay. So we are predominantly focusing on constitutionalism and the rise of the English constitutional monarchy. But we are also going to talk about two random things at the end that I want to pop in there because they're really important. The rise of Prussia and the Dutch Golden Age. Both of those things kind of don't really fit into one particular big overarching theme. So I throw them in at the end here just because we have time. We might as well cover them. But that's what we're doing. But let's go ahead. Let's review last week, because last week I talked really fast and I talked a lot. And I want to review a little bit what we covered, because what happened at the front end of Unit 3 is going to definitely impact what we talk about today. All right, so in Unit 3.1, we talked about the rise of absolutism in France and in Russia through consolidation of power, creating a cult of personality, reforming of the government, and economic reform. All right. And before we answer this question, were they actually successful? I want to talk a little bit about these 4 points here. And in chat, if you want to go ahead and type, you can just yes or no. Were Louis XIV and Peter I actually successful absolute monarchs? So if you want to do a yes and no in chat, I want to see what you guys think. But let's talk a little bit about these 4 points: consolidation of power, creating a cult of personality, reforming of the government, and economic reform. Okay, so these were kind of 4 general things that both Louis XIV did in France and Peter the Great did in Russia that helped solidify them as absolute monarchies in their countries. Okay, so with Louis XIV, he consolidates power by doing things like building the Palace of Versailles, forcing the nobility to live there. In France, he was also able to kind of structure the government in such a way that there was kind of like this bureaucratic step-like power structure, so that he was at the top and he kind of had all of his people working for him underneath him. In Russia, we know that in a very physical way, Peter took control of the nobility, shaving off their beards in some instances, but also creating a cult of personality, which I think is definitely more true with someone like Louis XIV in France, where he creates a real sense that he is this otherworldly being. And with Peter the Great, it was just kind of this big energy. And I will say the cult of personality around Peter the Great is almost bigger today than I think it probably was back then. Because Peter the Great is this very kind of mythical creature in history, this mythical person. Reforming of the government, bureaucratic reform, centralization of the government, economic reform as well. Certainly we look at that with Peter the Great, with Louis XIV establishing this mercantilist system of government and this mercantilist system of the economy, which Louis's economic sort of dabblings are going to cost France later on. Okay, and John, you said in France it's disputed, lots of wars, of course. And that's kind of, I think, with Louis, the big grain of salt that we have to take with this guy is that, yeah, he did a lot of stuff to try to solidify himself as an absolute king, but he wasn't actually that absolute in practice. Not always anyway. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. And I think that this brings me into the first point I want to make, and I use this example a lot because I think it's the best example that I've seen. Is that when we go to take the AP exam at the end of the month, or the end of May, not the end of the month, the end of May, do not assume when you don't assume these kind of factual things. When we say Louis, let me explain what I mean by that. With Louis XIV, we associate him with absolutism, which is absolutely correct. He is the example of absolutism. He checks all the boxes, right? But there is always this kind of like, is he actually absolutist? Is this actually true? Because very rarely in history are things black and white. Usually it's kind of gray, and you can definitely dispute whether he's absolute or not. And so when we take the DBQ at the end of May, don't always assume that, if College Board asks you, is Louis XIV a good example of an absolute king? And they give you documents that say that he wasn't, don't try to force this argument that he actually was using documents that suggest otherwise. Okay, College Board actually did that a few years ago. They gave this DBQ, and the DBQ was Louis XIV, actually a successful absolute king. And they gave all of these documents that said he wasn't. They were kind of suggesting that he wasn't actually that absolute of a king. And I think that it's easy to get stuck in a mindset where, okay, well, we associate him with absolutism, so I'm going to force this to make it work. And you don't always need to do that, because you can always argue one way or another in history for most things. So I always want to bring that up and say, don't always assume that there's a black and white yes or no answer. Okay. Just make sure that you're using your best historical reading skills and judgment. But I spent too long talking about review. Let's jump into new content today. So today we are covering the second half of Unit 3. That's constitutionalism. Now you might be asking yourself, what is constitutionalism? Okay, constitutionalism is the major competing ideology of the 17th and 18th century, competing against absolutism. I say, okay, these are foils of each other. They are, water and oil. These are two separate competing ideologies. We can almost think about this like liberalism versus conservatism in the 19th century, okay? Constitutionalism versus absolutism. So constitutionalism, government that is limited by a body of law, a constitution, but also usually some sort of physical manifestation of that. So normally it's going to be an executive that's limited by some other body of government. We see constitutionalism at work all over the world today. The United States is a constitutional-based government country, okay? We have a binding constitution. Our president, the executive, right? And I'm saying this as a general, like the actual position. They cannot do whatever they want because you have Congress that limits them. In turn, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court limits both of those bodies as well. Okay, this shared power where they all limit each other and they all keep each other in check. All right, I'm not going to dig too far into American government, but that is a good example of constitutionalism. We are going to see constitutionalism in action in England during the 15 and 16 and 1700s. Now, constitutionalism is not something that's necessarily has necessarily been around forever. And what I mean by that is that this is not something that is guaranteed. We tend to think that, of course, there is always going to be limiting some sort of limiting thing that limits government and limits what governments can and cannot do. But that's not guaranteed. That's something that we as humans made up. And really, we don't see the true heyday of constitutionalism until like the 1600s, or at least the start of the heyday of constitutionalism, to like the 16, 17, and even 1800s. Now, certainly, this is something that we can relate back to like ancient Rome and ancient Greece with the Roman Republic and the Greek democracies. But we know that those largely disappear with the establishment of the Roman Empire. Okay, by that point, we don't really see a true constitutional limited government in any sort of wide scale until constitutional England. But that's what constitutionalism is in a nutshell. So we see this start predominantly in England in the modern era anyway, and spread to other countries. All right. The United States is the best example of this, but also the Netherlands have a Dutch Republic. Okay. That is a limited government, a government that is staffed and run by the people. Okay. But let's go ahead and jump into it. And we actually have to go back in time a little bit before we get started. So England had some long-term experience with limited government, with the Magna Carta in 1215. Now, you might have learned about the Magna Carta at some point in middle school or maybe world history class, but it is certainly relevant in AP European history as well. This is signed by King John. King John, if you ever have seen the cartoon Robin Hood, with Robin Hood being portrayed by the fox, I don't think it was a Disney movie. I think it was another. It doesn't matter. It might have been Disney, actually. Anyway, not important. But the bad guy in Robin Hood is King John. And he's kind of portrayed throughout historical medium and media as being kind of like this bad guy. But effectively what happens is he wants to go to war. He wants to raise taxes to go to war. The nobility says, no, we're not going to give you the money and the people that you want and you need. And all of the nobility, a lot of the top nobility pretty much rebel against him. And they force him to sign the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta said was a few things. First, the king could not raise taxes without approval. As with a lot of things in the world and history, it all boils down to taxation. But the king cannot raise taxes without approval. But also, the king must govern according to the law. Now, that sounds pretty dang classically liberal. Now, the Magna Carta is not a constitution per se. It's not going to really have kind of the binding power as something like the English Bill of Rights or the American Constitution, something like that. But it is a very important legal document. It has power, but we're not quite at like full-blown constitutional monarchy quite yet. Now, what it does also establish is the Great Council, and the Great Council will eventually become the English Parliament. I believe it's King John's grandson who ends up establishing the model Parliament. And what it said was that if John wanted, or any other future English king wanted to raise taxes, they had to consult the Great Council. And who staffed the Great Council? It was the nobility. So pretty much the nobility said, you're going to consult all of us before you raise taxes. And we're going to call ourselves the Great Council, and we're going to sound very official. But that's what you're going to do. It's all based around money. All right. Now this is all well and good. And it kind of just, it sits there for a while and doesn't really, nothing for a few hundred years is really substantially going to happen because of it. Okay. But what it does establish, and I know I say substantially, we'll see what I mean in here in just a second, but what it does is when it establishes Parliament, it establishes some sort of representative body, even if it wasn't very representative of England as a whole. It really was only staffed by the nobility. So it establishes some sort of representative body, but it also establishes a mindset in England that the king cannot do whatever the king wants to do. Okay. And in the Middle Ages, that wasn't a huge deal because we know the kings didn't really have that much power, right? A lot of the power rested with the nobility. They rested with the top tier nobility at that. The king was all powerful, but really only in name alone. The king relied heavily on the nobility. So for the Middle Ages, right, it's like, okay, this is fine. Nothing substantial is going to happen because of this. But when the new monarchies are established and we start hearing about this absolutism thing, we're going to start running into some issues. And in walks the Stuarts to cause just those issues. So we're going to jump back forward in time to where we are right now with the death of Elizabeth I. Okay, so 1603, we are now 400 years after the original signing of the Magna Carta, give or take a few years there. And Elizabeth I has just died. Elizabeth I being part of the Tudor dynasty. She is the last of the Tudors because she never gets married. She does not have any legitimate children, although there are some that claim she had children. None legitimate, though. She never gets married. And so she dies without an official heir. And so when this happens, the Parliament looks towards the next closest relative. Here's the problem with England, is England does not have an official, law or outline that they follow for this hereditary based monarchy. What I mean by that is typically it goes to the eldest son, right? When the king dies, their eldest son takes the throne. But what happens? They don't have an eldest son, which happens a lot in history. some countries are going to have, written out, this is the steps that we're going to take. It's going to go to the brother. If there's no brother, it's going to go to the oldest, closest cousin. If so on and so on. In England, that's not the case. They don't have that. And so you end up seeing this real mess of like a family tree where all sorts of people are becoming king. That really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay. It would effectively be like, if there was no real rule for what happens if the king is, or if the United States president is assassinated or steps down, right? It would just be this massive power struggle. And that's kind of one of the issues we see in England. And we're going to see it come to fruition a little bit here. But anyway, getting off track. The throne passes to the Stuart family. Now, we had talked about the Stuart family with Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the mother of this guy right here, James IV. He had been ruling Scotland since he was a wee little babe at 1 year old. And he had been ruling Scotland when he takes the English throne for about 35 years or so. So he'd been ruling his whole life. And he is going to take the English throne in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth. He is the closest relative to Elizabeth, and he takes the throne. He's going to rule until 1625. So this guy rules from his whole entire life in some capacity. And the issue that we run into now is that in Scotland, there is no Magna Carta, right? This is an English thing. And we can't confuse this with Great Britain versus England. This is English, as in like the lower bottom part of the big island in the British Isles, right? That England. He had been ruling Scotland as an absolute king, and he wanted to continue ruling as an absolute king. You better believe it. And he comes over into England. He's made king, and he says, "What the heck? What do you mean I can't do whatever I want? Are you kidding me?" And a lot of this came down from his belief in divine right, this idea that God had appointed him king, and he is God's representative on earth. And so he runs into a lot of issues, specifically with Parliament. He clashes with Parliament throughout his rule, but doesn't actually ever do anything too dramatic with Parliament. Now, a few important things that happened here. One is he's going to informally unite Great Britain. He wants to rule over a united Great Britain, a united British Isles, effectively. That's never made official. It's not going to be made official for a few generations, but he starts that precedent, right? King of Scotland, King of England. Let's wrap the whole thing up with a nice little bow here and call it Great Britain. Okay. He's also going to clash with the Puritans, and the reason he clashes with the Puritans is for one. He believes in religious unity. I mean, he is a kind of classical absolutist king. He believes in religious unity. And the Puritans were these hardcore conservative Protestants. And he very much believes in the Episcopal model as opposed to the Presbyterian model. And what I mean by this, and I don't want to get too far into it because I don't think it's actually that important for you guys to know, but the Episcopal model is the model that was established with the Act of Supremacy by Henry VIII. Pretty much puts the English king at the top of the pyramid, right? He's at the top, and then he controls everything that happens with the church underneath him, right? He is effectively, the Pope for lack of a better word. Presbyterian system is more of like a circle, if you want to think about it like that, where all of the major church leaders are based on some level of equality, and they talk and interact and collectively come up with ways that they want to run the church. And he had been using the Presbyterian system in Scotland for his whole rule, and he comes over in England. He says, "I actually really like this Episcopal model. I think I'm going to roll with this." It really irritates the Puritans. Another thing that he does to irritate the Puritans is the Book of Sports, pretty much banning sports on Sundays unless you had attended church previously that day, which the Puritans weren't going to church. They were just paying the tax to not go to church, and now they can no longer play sports. And all this was kind of in the name of religious religious uniformity. But it's also going to push the Puritans out of England and eventually to the Americas, where they are, the Pilgrims, and Thanksgiving and all that stuff. But what this does do on a more broader sense is it starts to kind of create these really big unhappy ripples throughout Puritan communities in England, which will come to a head here in just a little bit. So that's James the First. Causing waves, causing ripples, testing the system, right? He's an absolutist. He's testing the Magna Carta system. But generally speaking, no real major problems. But he dies. And now we have Charles the First. And oh, Charles the First. Charles I is going to rule from 1625 to 1649. His rule is going to be cut short when his head is cut off of his body. Charles I is going to cause ripples. He's going to cause pretty substantial ripples in England. Okay. He is also, like Dad, a firm believer in divine right and a firm believer in absolutism. And he's going to double down on clashing with Parliament. And it gets to the point where he just says, wait a minute, I'm the one who calls Parliament, the king, me. So I'm just not going to call Parliament. And for years, he does not call Parliament. And Parliament, they're irritated. All right. They're like, no, that's like, no, you can't do that. No, you have to call us. You can't do that. And for years, he doesn't call Parliament. Now, eventually, what's going to happen is he's going to call them kind of on and off for several years. He's going to call them when he needs to go to war, and they're going to say, we're not supporting your war. And so he dismisses them again, and then he calls them again. And then eventually what's going to happen is that he's going to eventually try to have them all arrested. Pretty much what happens is the last time Parliament says, look, we're not working with you until you recognize our importance and you recognize the limits that you have as a king. And Charles is not at all happy with this. And the final time he goes, sends some guards to round up the members of Parliament and arrest them. Now, unfortunately for him, the members of Parliament have been tipped off to this and they bail and leave Parliament. And this starts the English Civil War, the war between Parliament and England. And this is really where we see the Magna Carta and versus absolutism, right? Because the whole reason that Parliament exists is because of the Magna Carta. And really, it had never come to this big of an issue previously. It had never caused issues like this really previously. Now, there's a lot of detail that I'm glossing over here. Okay, a lot of detail with the relationship between Charles I and Parliament. Okay, I gloss over all of these like things that Parliament's issues that they want Charles I to agree to, like the Grand Remonstrance and the all of these smaller details that I'm not covering just because we can't right now, and I think that this is good enough information. But certainly go and review it. Certainly go take a look at it. But this is the stuff that I think you guys really need to know. Okay, so I'll just put that out there. But English Civil War, we are going to get into it right now. Now, with all wars, you do not necessarily need to know the specific details. We need to know causes and we need to know effects. We're also going to talk about major parties here. Okay, so the war lasts from 1642 to 1648, so it lasts for 6 years. And you have two main factions here. The first is the Cavaliers, those that sided with the king. This tended to be the nobility that were not in Parliament, the older, like landed gentry nobility. And then you had the Roundheads, those that did side with Parliament. Puritans, okay? Puritans who we mentioned with James I. They side with Parliament because they're really irritated with Charles I, right? They haven't been happy with the Stuarts for this whole darn time. So they side with Parliament here. So these are our two major factions. And this is an incredibly bloody and brutal war, as all civil wars tend to be. But it's even worse that during this era, we have the Little Ice Age happening in in Europe, and I mean the world, but specifically in Europe, where you have way colder than normal temperatures. Crops aren't growing, crops are dying, people are freezing to death or starving. Throw on top of that the bubonic plague breaks out again, and throughout England, hits London especially hard with like 50,000 people in London dying because of the bubonic plague. And then you throw a civil war on top of that, just kind of the cherry. And I saw this statistic today that I think is mind-blowing. During this time, the English Civil War, England lost a larger percentage of their population during the English Civil War, this time period, than they did during both World War I and World War II combined. So that's not number of casualties, that's percentage of population. But they lose a massive percentage of their population during this time. It's brutal and it's bloody and it's vicious. But what ends up happening here is a few important things. First, the new model army is raised by the Roundheads. This is going to become kind of almost like a nationalized army, which they're kind of still new at this point. A nationalized army led by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, who we'll return to here in just a second. Now, the war ends when Charles I is rounded up and he is executed. And what I want to talk about and what I really want to focus on here, and this is kind of one of our big talking points, is why is it a big deal that Charles I is executed? Okay, this is something I want to sit you on. This is something I want us to think about here, because this is something that, you know, we might say, okay, yeah, Civil War, Charles I is executed. That makes sense. But this is a huge, huge deal. This is the people of England putting their king on trial and executing him, finding him guilty and cutting his head off. That is massively, massively out of the ordinary. It's new and it's a big deal. And what it does, what it establishes, is the idea the King of England is not above the people of England. He is not above the laws of the land. He is not above the things that limit him. Okay? And this is what it establishes. It is the biggest power move by Parliament ever. Right? Because what they're saying is that, look, we made an agreement 400 years ago that you are still expected to abide by, that you are limited by us. We exist so that we can work together as a unified government. And when you don't abide by that, you are treasonous and you die. Okay? I mean, it is the biggest power move, and it is this massive shift, right? Not everywhere, but in England especially, a shift where Parliament is now sort of in the driver's seat. And really, after this point, Parliament's not getting out of the driver's seat. We're going to have some tough kings. We're going to have some kings that are, you know, we would probably consider powerful kings. But Parliament's in the driver's seat. Definitely in the driver's seat, okay? And slowly but surely, they're going to get to the point where they are now, where the king and the queen, I mean, now the queen, but the monarchy virtually does nothing in England. It starts here. It starts really right here. This is a big turning point in English history. Okay. Now, I say all this because when we talk about the English Civil War, you know, you can throw in dates and you can throw in numbers and you can talk about casualties and all this stuff, but I think that's the big takeaway. When we talk about the English Civil War, why the heck is it important? Why the heck are we talking about it? It's because this was a big turning point in English history. This was a turning point where you have a definite before and you have a definite after, where now Parliament is in the driving seat and they are really controlling things. You know, I mean, that's a thing with civil wars, especially civil wars that don't happen often, is that there's definitely a definite before and there's a definite after. You know, we compare this to something like the American Civil War, where after the American Civil War, you now have an America that looks totally different. Slavery is abolished. We have 3 new amendments. Things are different. And it's the same thing with the English Civil War, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, and an immediate effect anyway. It's a lesser degree for sure, but a definite before and a definite after. Definitely. All right, so Charles I is dead. What now? Now we enter into a very strange 10 years in British history, and that's the Puritan Dictatorship, also known as the Puritan Republic. It was a dictatorship through and through. So Charles I is executed. Now what? Well, Cromwell has this army that's virtually under his control, and he wants to keep it that way. He likes having this army. I mean, he is a guy that is, I mean, he lives and he dies for war. That's where his power is derived from, and there's no war going on anymore. And so what he does is, using his new model army, he pretty much ousts anybody who disagree with him, who would go against him, and he establishes himself as being the absolute ruler of England for just about 10 years. And this is a really strange time in history for sure, because it's this like massive, if we think about like a rubber band, right? You stretch a rubber band, you stretch a rubber band, you stretch a rubber band, and you let it go and it bounces back immediately, right? This is this bounce back, right? This is this kind of immediate after effect of the English Civil War that was so destructive and it was so devastating that you end up having kind of the immediate inverse effects of what you really went for with this Puritan dictatorship guy. Now, this lasts for 10 years. His son tried to take power. That doesn't work out. He's not nearly the leader that his father was. And so now what? Now what? Now what do we do? And that's the question that Parliament has to ask themselves. So Parliament, they read the situation. They say, look, if we don't return to some long-term normalcy, we're going to have another civil war. So they say, look, we need to restore the English monarchy. We need to get the Stuarts back on the throne. This was the most logical step for Parliament. So they call to the son of Charles I, Charles II. They call Charles II to take what was rightfully his and take back the throne. And Charles I says, sure. And we might be thinking to yourself, and we might be thinking to ourselves, why the heck would Charles II take the throne when he just saw his father executed? And I mean, in all honesty, it's because he wanted the power, he wanted to be king, but certainly, he is going to rule modestly, all right? It's going to be this kind of, we brought you into this world, we can bring you out of it too if we want to type effects, right? We've all heard that before. And this is what Parliament tells them. I mean, it doesn't really tell them, but this is the vibe he gets from Parliament is Parliament says, Parliament brought him into this world. Parliament can remove him if they so choose to. And so he's going to rule very, very modestly for his entire reign. And nothing substantial happens in terms of like changes to the government or to the country. He actually deals with like several natural disasters, including London burning down, that he kind of deals with. But that's kind of the extent of Charles II's rule. He tries to really stay in his lane, right? He knows that like, I'm not going to mess with Parliament. I'll do what they want me to do. I'll rule as a king, but I'll respect the wishes of Parliament. Oh, James II. He is another story altogether. Charles I dies without Charles II dies without a legitimate heir. So it goes to his brother, James II. Now, James II is going to cause some very real problems from Parliament. Namely, he was Catholic. Now, that's pretty much it. James II was Catholic, and Parliament didn't like that all too much. The biggest reason was because England is Anglican. They're Protestant, and they worked very hard to establish themselves as being Protestant, and they're not going to take this Catholic king screwing it all up. But to make matters worse is that he ends up giving birth, not him, his wife, ends up giving birth to a Catholic son. And the fear of a Catholic dynasty, of a Catholic royal, Stuart royal family, scares the bejesus out of Parliament. And in fact, Parliament really didn't care too much that James II was Catholic. I mean, they cared, but they made a deal with him. They said, you can practice Catholicism in private. You can do your thing, whatever. But when he has a son, a Catholic son at that, that's when things become more problematic. So this brings us to the Glorious Revolution, and Parliament decides that they are going to remove the tyrannical James II. And I use that in quotes because this is definitely the narrative that Parliament tries to sell, is that James II is a tyrant and he is bad for the people of England. And while he wasn't the best king, the big issue was his religion. It wasn't really anything else. But this is the narrative that Parliament is going to try to sell. What they do is they look towards Charles or James II's Protestant daughter, Mary, who happens to be married to William of Orange. And the Parliament looks to William and Mary and they say, hey, y'all want to rule England? And they say, yeah, sure, that sounds good. And Parliament invites William and Mary to come rule and take over England. And this is going to become known as the Glorious Revolution. And it's going to become known as a Glorious Revolution because it's not bloody. It's not a bloody, violent revolution, at least in London. In fact, William and Mary, when they land in England, they are paraded through the streets like war heroes. I mean, they open up the gates and they lay down the roses and the red carpet for them. Now, the deal that Parliament makes with William and Mary is that if they want to rule together, they have to sign the English Bill of Rights. And this is really where we see constitutionalism sink its claws into England. Besides outlining basic rights for all English citizens, it also gave legislative power to the Parliament, pretty much saying Parliament will create the laws. The king is going to execute those laws. Think about it like, again, I'm going to use the America example because it's a good example. Congress versus the executive branch, right? The legislative branch versus the executive branch. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch executes the laws, and the judicial branch upholds the law, right? But there's a difference between executive and legislative. Congress versus the president. Same thing here. The king is going to do all like they're going to do all the foreign policy stuff. They're going to do all that stuff. They're going to enforce the law, but Parliament is the one that actually makes the law. So that's a really, really big difference, and that's a very big, broad, powerful power that Congress now is granted, that they weren't granted with the Magna Carta. But also outlining basic rights for English citizens is very, very important as well. It gives all English citizens protection under the law. So things like due process, that the king can't arrest anybody that they want to. Then this really completed this full shift to a constitutional monarchy. Okay. So that is the specific details of constitutional, the arc of constitutionalism in England. A direct response in a lot of ways to absolutism, but also really kind of showcasing what's to come in the future. Now, before we switch gears and when we talk about Prussia and we talk about the Netherlands, I want to briefly bring up two folks in particular who I think are some of the two most important people that you need to know for this class. And that's Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes on the left and John Locke there on the right. And why do we need to know about these two guys? Well, really, these are probably the two most important political theorists in European history. You can make the argument. Certainly, I think John Locke might be the most important political theorist in European history. But definitely, they're probably the two most important British political theorists anyways. And they give two very different viewpoints of how humanity should be ruled. And they're a good example of these two kind of competing ideologies of absolutism and constitutionalism. So we'll talk a little bit about them here just now. So Thomas Hobbes, he writes his book, The Leviathan. And if you haven't ever seen the cover of The Leviathan, I definitely recommend going and Googling it. It's very cool looking. So Thomas Hobbes writes his book, The Leviathan, and it's a very pessimistic, negative viewpoint of humanity. He pretty much sees humans in their natural state as barbarous, greedy, evil. They're willing to betray and kill for their own personal wants and needs. That pretty much it is pure anarchy in its natural state. And he sees the role of government as being fundamental to keeping people in line. He believes that an absolutist, strong ruler, whatever that might look like, is important to keep people in line. That people, the humanity, whenever they agree to be ruled, it's because they need protection from themselves. The role of government is to protect people from themselves. That is Hobbes' viewpoint of government. Now, let's look at that compared to someone like John Locke. John Locke is going to believe in kind of a fundamentally different idea of humanity. John Locke is a very optimistic viewpoint of humanity, that humanity is a blank slate, that they're naturally good. The tabula rasa, right? The blank slate idea that humanity is shaped not by its natural instincts, but instead by where it's raised, nature versus nurture. And Locke says that the role of government is not to protect people from themselves, but to protect their natural rights. And Locke is the one that coins this term, this idea, natural rights. And according to John Locke, natural rights are life, liberty, and property. Three things that are fundamentally guaranteed to humanity. And that it's the government's job to protect those three things, to protect the individual's natural rights, whether that's protection from other people or protection from the government itself. That is the job and the role of the government. And this is really classical liberalism. This is really fundamentally the idea that the government is there, it exists not to necessarily keep people in line and keep people in check, but to protect the individual. John Locke is the reason why I say he's probably the most important is because these ideas of natural rights, they are going to echo really fundamentally throughout the American War for Independence, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, but certainly the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the Napoleonic Code, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, John Locke's ideas are the base for what becomes representative modern democracies and republics. So these two guys really represent, the yin and yang of the time period, absolutism versus constitutionalism, and how they butt heads with each other. So I think they're really, really good to know here. We'll talk more about John Locke when we talk about the Enlightenment next week. We'll do Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment. So we'll talk a little bit more about him, but he is very, very much good to know. So I'm coming up on 10 minutes here, which is actually great. As we transition to the last few things. But first, before we do that, I want to talk about what are our big takeaways. And first of all, you'll see that is the Queen of England, Elizabeth II, on the right there, standing with all members of the royal family. Not all of them, but the close members of the royal family. And I think that this is a really good example of our big takeaways. It sets England on this course that this is where we will eventually get, where England still has a monarchy, but it is a monarchy that is fundamentally crippled by Parliament, because Parliament is in the driver's seat, and they've been in the driver's seat since the English Civil War. This also answers the question of why does England still have a monarchy, right? When France and Germany and Russia, they don't have kings or queens, because England does this slow, methodical, political change to their government. They don't have major revolutions and major coups and constitution writings and constitution ripping ups and writing new constitutions. Okay, they are very much slow, methodical changes to their government. Parliament slowly but surely gains more and more and more power throughout the 1700s and the 1800s. That's why. And I think that's the big takeaway here is that constitutionalism, it's a slow, methodical process in England that eventually gets us to where we are today. All right, so when you think about the Glorious Revolution and its importance, this is a body of people that are not succumbing to the wills of one individual person, of a king, which is definitely fundamentally different than France or Russia or Prussia or Austria, right? This is fundamentally different. So those are our big takeaways. Now, let's talk about the last few things very quickly here. So first and foremost, I always like showing maps because I think they're really good to kind of get a visual of what we're talking about. Europe in 1700. So a few things I want to mention here. First of all, we do have Great Britain there at the top. Great Britain is going to be officially solidified by the 1700s. They're officially going to be officially Great Britain, uniting England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. France virtually looks the same as it does today, minus a little bit of land. But you'll also notice that that Central Europe looks really kind of different. Holy Roman Empire is crippled. It's pretty much done for. It exists in name and name alone. But really, it's these strong independent cities or independent principalities that are going to be ruling Central Europe. The Habsburg monarchy, which is Austria at this point, later will be Austria-Hungary, but for now it's just Austria, is massive and it's bloated and it's going to cause some problems. And the Ottoman Empire is still very much pushing its way into southeastern Europe. So this is Europe in the 1700s. It's very messy still. And we're going to focus today on Prussia, and we're going to focus on the Netherlands for the last little bit. So let's talk about the rise of Prussia. A country that's not quite Poland and not quite Russia. Prussia kind of comes a little bit out of nowhere. First of all, I'll talk about what it is. It's a few different things. First of all, it's Brandenburg, Prussia. So it's two separate but united principalities, a collections of land that are ruled by the Hohenzollern family, and their Hohenzollern family is going to be the royal family of Prussia and later Germany. It includes Prussia, Brandenburg, of course, lands along the Rhine River as well. So we'll see it's kind of this almost scattershot of different lands that existed in northern Germany. But Prussia is sort of going to stumble its way into being the most powerful principality in Germany outside of Austria. And it really starts with this guy here, Frederick William. He's going to rule from 1640 to 1688 as Prince of Prussia, not king. He's going to create unity among his landholdings, tame the power of the local nobility, all of those things that we say a good absolutist, in this case, prince, must do. He's also going to create a Prussian standing army, and eventually he kind of earns the ability from the Holy Roman Emperor to name his successor the King of Prussia, not just the prince. So now this is a kingdom, no longer just a principality. A little minor detail, but I think kind of interesting. Now, this idea of the military being very important is going to be the kind of driving force of Prussia and then later Germany. The Prussian army and the Prussian military is going to be the best in all of Europe, to the point where people are hiring Prussian officers to come train their troops because they're just so darn good. Now, Frederick William I, who rules from 1713 to 1740, is going to work to really establish himself as an absolute king, a Prussian absolute king, transforming Prussia into a true military state. I mean, Prussia becomes the Sparta of the modern era in pretty much every single way, besides the, like, we're going to kill all of our weak children part. They don't do that, but they are a military state, kind of a la Sparta. They valued their military more than absolutely anything else, establishing the best and most advanced military in the world, but also modernizing the bureaucracy and the economy like you do if you're an absolute king. Okay. They're also going to require that all Prussian men receive military training and enlist in the reserve. So Prussia, by the time we get to the mid-1700s, is a force to be reckoned with in a lot of ways. And they are a strong military, a strong economy, and they're definitely on the up and up. And we will talk more about Prussia next week when we talk about Frederick the Great. But last thing we're going to talk about today is the Dutch Golden Age. Now, the Dutch Golden Age is exactly what it sounds like. It's a roughly 100-year-long span of Dutch dominance of the spice trade and most of the overseas trade. It's going to the Dutch are also going to lead the world in a lot of artistic movements, political movements as well, social and economic developments. And again, we're going to look at the causes and effect here. The Dutch Golden Age, I seriously doubt the DBQ is going to be on the Dutch Golden Age. I would be I don't know why Siri just activated. That was strange. I don't know why the Dutch. I would be very surprised if the Dutch Golden Age was on the DBQ. It's possible, but we're just going to cover the causes and effects today. If you want to dig in more, Crash Course has, I think, 2 videos on the Dutch Golden Age. I believe we have Fiveable has a video or 2 on the Dutch Golden Age. So there's resources out there, but I'm just going to hit the causes and effects for sake of time. Causes are: 1, the Dutch have a great skilled labor force. The development of capitalist principles, which they heavily lean into, which we know are going to spur and kind of like grow the fire of trade and of economic development. They also control the spice trade and the spice market in Asia for about 100 years before they're kind of bucked off by the British. And their geography, I mean, they are a country that has a lot of coastline, which is great for shipbuilding. They become master shipbuilders, and that obviously lends itself to trade very well. And what are the impacts here? The Dutch become a major European economic power for about 100 years. They've kind of virtually controlled all trade in Europe. It sort of shifts from Italy to the Netherlands in a lot of ways, and then establishment of some colonies in the New World, including the establishment of New Amsterdam, which will eventually become New York City. But that is it for today. So that's pretty much the end of Unit 3. I know, kind of ending on a weird note with some random things, but absolutism versus constitutionalism. It is 10 o'clock. We ended on time this week, and I got to ramble a little bit, so it was a good stream. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will be posting this on Fiveable, so if you want to go back and watch. The study guide is also under the Cram session tab, the Cram Pass tab, so go check out the study guide if you need to. If you have any questions, of course, Steven@fiveable.com is where you need to email me at, or fiveable.me, excuse me. But that is all I'm going to say about that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful night, and I will catch you all an hour before this time, at 9 o'clock next Tuesday, where we'll be covering Unit 4, the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment.